But where are you really from?
A podcast about the Asian American struggle.
Hi there, I'm Jesse Lynn.
And I'm Angela Lynn, and welcome back to another episode of But Where Are You Really From?
Before we get started, we just wanted to let you guys know that we are discussing topics around racism this week. So if this is not comfortable for you, you've been warned.
But if you are comfortable, we're about to get into it now. So,
yes.
First we want to talk about the elephant in the room. It is coronavirus right now. We're all stuck in quarantine, and something that's been popping up in headlines over and over again is the fact that there's a ton of anti-Asian racism happening as a result of COVID-19. So we wanted to talk a little bit about why this racism is happening now, why it should not be happening, and if it's actually something that's like net new, or if it's based on a pretty strong foundation of historical racism against our community. In terms of the latter, I think our hypothesis is that it's not new. It's just a new reason and kind of forum for people who are racist against our community to feel justified in kind of doubling down on that hatred, because there is a history behind keeping Asians out of the community and kept in this kind of other label. So looking back at like 100+ years ago, when Chinese immigrants were first coming to America, at that point, there was a Chinese Exclusion Act because, you know, our people are hardworking. We're willing to take up whatever jobs there are and make our way through. And white people weren't happy about that back then. So they were already trying to bar Chinese immigrants from coming to the US back then. And that was a long time ago. You could argue that things have gotten better since then. But then in the 1940s, Japanese people got the brunt of the hatred and they were forced into the internment camps. That's not that long ago. And then as you get further into modern day, you realize, wait, it didn't stop at all. The civil rights movement wasn't just about Black people. Obviously, that was a huge part of that movement, but it also had huge impacts on the equality of all people of color. So we were definitely included in that. And then 9/11 was probably like the most recent case of anti-Asian in the kind of broader sense. But basically, if you had brown skin, you were racially profiled during that time and had a lot of hate towards you. So net, not new.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look back at the history that you just walked us through, what I see basically is there's a legacy of racism. But I think coming off of our episode last week where we talk about media representation, I think it's also really important to take a look at things that are being really pushed by how the media or certain figures in the media, cough, cough, our president, are representing this pandemic to the public. And one of the things that we really want to talk about is why it's problematic to present the virus as a Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus. You can see a lot of the reasons why from the WHO, but there are a number of problems with that. The first is that it really connects the illness to a specific group of people, and creating that connection suggests there's some kind of fault of the illness belonging to that region or that people, and somehow that they caused it or they intended this to occur. It's also problematic from the standpoint of people living here, because I think people can start to think about it. And of course, I think we all did through the lens of false security, because we were like, oh, it's in Wuhan, China. Like, that's so far away. Yeah. Like, there's no way that's going to like get all the way here. It's just like SARS, it's going to die down. And I think that really gave a sense of false security to people where they should have been more careful at the time. In a sense, it also scapegoats people. So people care less about what's happening, where you're talking about, oh, it's a situation or it's a disease that's happening over there. It doesn't really matter to us. So I think there are things stemming out of the legacy of racism in the US, but there are also many, many things that are being instigated by, let's say, exaggerated or misinformation around the pandemic.
Another challenge that's been coming up, and the reason behind a lot of the attacks that have been happening lately, is that aside from the sense of false security of like it's only happening in China, there's also this misperception that like it's in Chinese people's blood or something, that like if you're Chinese, you already have coronavirus. So like if you encounter a
Mm.
Chinese person on the street and they cough, then like you're gonna get coronavirus because they're Chinese and they happen to be around
Mhm.
you. I think that actually a huge portion of the attacks have been because they're like, ew, Chinese person, you have coronavirus, I don't want it. And they're like trying to they actually think that like all Chinese people have coronavirus or something. So that's just like another form of stupidity, but is like an association that people have, just because if you call it like the Chinese virus, especially, you know.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there. It's a situation where immediately connects our community of people to this particular pandemic, and it eliminates all of the kind of critical thinking that happens in
Mhm.
between, in the sense that like all of that kind of is removed and replaced by this like terrible kind of gut reaction to a person based off of what they look like.
Totally. Okay, so then to wrap up this kind of opening section to set up this topic, we wanted to talk a little bit about how it's making this anti-Asian movement right now is making us feel as Asian Americans.
I mean, for me, it's just kind of like getting a cold glass of water thrown in your face because, part of the pursuit of my own personal life has been to go after all the things that will make me appear successful. And people always think that once you get to that level, you're not touchable in a sense,
Mm,
like you're above the lower layer of being able to be brought down by superficial things, and that people will see you for your merit and your
mm,
contribution. And this is one of those situations. What I mean by cold glass of water to the face is you can see it's really not the case. Like
yeah.
there is really, really deep seated hatred for other type people. And it really just comes roaring out, and like that ugliness comes out and becomes very visible in situations like this where it's very extreme, there's a very extreme circumstance. So for me, it's literally like a cold glass of water to my face. I don't know what to do. I'm a little bit in shock. I'm just kind of wondering what has happened because someone threw a cold glass of water in my face. So that's how I'm feeling about seeing all this kind of news surface.
Yeah. Definitely, for sure. For me, also, that I can relate to that cold glass of water feeling. It also kind of like wakes you up to remind you that you're different. That you,
Mhm.
just from like an appearance standpoint, right? Like that's all they can base off of right now, especially when everyone's wearing masks, right? It's just
Mhm.
like top half of your face pretty much, but they're going to judge you instantly based on that. So for me, it's made me frankly scared and like paranoid to go outside, because
Yeah.
even though we both live in like, super metropolitan, multicultural cities, there's still racism in both these cities. And certainly
Mhm.
a lot of the attacks that have been happening have happened in both our cities. And so I don't want to kid myself that just because I'm in San Francisco and not like middle America, that when I walk outside, there isn't a chance that I'm going to get some negative attention. So when I rarely go outside now. And when I do go for like grocery shopping or whatever, I'm super paranoid. I look all around me. I'm like expecting someone to yell at me at any moment. And it's just not a great way to live. I hate it.
3 Asian American family members, including a 2-year-old and 6-year-old, were stabbed. The suspect indicated that he stabbed the family because he thought the family was Chinese and infecting people with the coronavirus.
It's a disturbing video that has gotten worldwide attention. Video posted to Instagram showing an older Asian man in San Francisco's Bayview neighborhood collecting empty cans, being confronted, assaulted, and humiliated by a man as others watch.
Sunday night in Diker Heights, police say this 51-year-old resident was simply taking out her garbage when a man doused her with some kind of chemical, which burned her face, neck, shoulders, and back. The Asian American victim was rushed to the hospital while the man took off.
Wow, so these are pretty heavy stories, and I'm sure there's stories that you guys have heard. They've been around the news pretty heavily, but we also wanted to take some time to focus on some local stories, some stories that are kind of near and dear to our hearts and our local communities. So I'll kick it off to Angela to feature her first story.
This story came from the incident report that's run by the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council. So because people are scared to report these attacks, these daily incidents that are happening to them, to the police. So this council, which is a nonprofit that y'all should donate to, but they, starting like a month ago or more, created this incident report that is translated into many, many different Asian languages, making it as accessible as possible to all the various Asian communities that are facing hatred right now, for people to easily and anonymously report what's happening to them in the streets. And just want to throw out a stat so everyone knew like the degree to which this is happening. Per week, that council is receiving 1,100 reports every week, which is insane, because if you think about it, 1,100 is way lowballing it, because these are only the people that are willing to fill out this form.
Yeah.
Like, think about how many people are just like taking these, especially the verbal assaults, and just like trying to brush it off, but obviously it's like impacting their lives, right? If 1,100 is what's documented, I can only imagine how many are actually happening per week. It's just crazy. So I wanted to highlight one that is a bit untraditional and shows you that this racism is like pervading into all different channels, platforms, like ways of community. And it's just harboring this feeling of like, we're not safe anywhere. So the story that I'm choosing here was written in by someone in a university, and they talked about how they were holding a Zoom conference because everyone has to, you know, do everything over video call right now. And I'm sure most of you have heard that Zoom has been under a lot of security breaches recently, because so many people are now using Zoom, and it's like fairly easy for people to hack into other people's conference calls. So basically, the student organization was using Zoom to hold board elections for their organization, and there were 40 or more people on the call of all different Asian American descent. And then all of a sudden, the call was interrupted by a bunch of random anonymous hackers who started flooding the call with all this hateful speech, racial slurs. They were using like fake broken English to mock everyone because they could see that everyone was Asian. And one of them apparently yelled like, "All y'all have coronavirus, every single one of you." So this just goes again to that, like, first of all, just blind hatred, but like definitely points to that bullshit of like people just assuming that because you're Asian, you have coronavirus. Like, what the fuck is that?
I agree, and situations like this I always find really strange in a sense, because like you must be going like way out of your way. I'm talking like you drove 5 hours in the wrong direction to piss somebody off, to show how deeply I think racism against Asians and racism in general is ingrained in the American like society, the public, that someone would go so far out of their way to really put a group of people down for no reason. Like, these people were minding their own business, they were doing their own activity that had nothing to do with, it wasn't even organizing or anything. You know, that really pisses me off, because you're basically just going to someone's activity, like flipping them off for no reason, and then like leaving. That's awful, and I can't imagine why anyone would want to do that.
It also feels so invasive. Like, can you imagine if like our FaceTime that we're doing right now, someone randomly like hacked it and started yelling racial slurs at us? Like, I would be so shocked and like wouldn't know how to react, because that's not what I expect within the context of like having this seemingly intimate conversation. Yeah.
And I also think it's, to what we were saying earlier, like, it's not what you would expect from another person in general, right? Like, that level of hatred, usually people are like, you have to work to earn that level of hatred from somebody. Like, you really gotta work. But like for somebody to just come up into your private space, as you mentioned, and be so vile to you, that's really deep, deep ingrained hatred, I think. As with all things like this, it hurts both you and the person that you're trying to attack, right? Like, frankly, it's a personal waste of time for a hacker to do something like that, because they're just going to reschedule their board meeting and they're going to move on. Like,
add a password.
Exactly. So you're really just wasting your own time, twiddling and pissing other people off for no reason.
It also makes me kind of sad because, like, when hatred is directed towards young people, especially, like, these are university kids. Like, they're not even like full-grown adults out in society, right? Like, I don't know. Part of me is like, I'd like to shield them from the hatred that's happening outside, and it makes me really sad that, like, they're experiencing this. There's no shelter right now because everything's happening over the internet. So it's like all bets are off.
I have to agree with you on that point regarding, I think, what you're talking about in terms of their innocence. Although we know we're not that innocent in college. But I'm just saying, like, college for me was such a great couple of years because I found a group of people who, like, really treated me for me, uplifted me, and celebrated the person that I am. For that not to be the experience of someone else, I think it is really, really sad and disheartening. Something like that is just, like, really, you just feel icky about it and you feel gross. And you don't feel nice because you didn't deserve it. It wasn't like anything that you did, and there's nothing you did to deserve it and nothing you can do to prevent it. And I think that both of those things are really hard for a person to swallow.
So that was mine. What did you want to share?
Yeah, so what I wanted to share was kind of just a very local incidence of basically someone being attacked for looking Asian. And basically what happened was there was an attack of a woman on a New York City bus by a bunch of teenage girls. And it happened up in the Bronx, I think in, like, basically the middle of the day. She wasn't doing anything. So this is one of those things that I wanted to feature. There are multiple things that go against the idea that racism doesn't exist anymore. And the first thing is, it happened in a very visible place. The woman is riding a public bus. It happened during the day, so it's not like the woman was riding the bus at, like, a really late hour or an hour you might consider to be unsafe. So those are, like, the first two things. Like, people always blame the victim, time and the place. Well, it's not the situation for her. And the third thing is that there is always a kind of everybody loses scenario with these attacks, because then people immediately, it's minorities attacking minorities. Look at how gross all of them are. And so I think that those are all, like, huge problems that are, like, lumped up into this one attack. And what makes me feel really sad about it is that, same with your situation, it's unprovoked. Like, people are kind of going out of their way to make other people miserable, and in doing so, harming themselves. Because if she got the coronavirus, you have it now from attacking her.
That's
if
true.
you stayed away, you probably wouldn't have had it. So, like, it's all these things where you're kind of just like, you can slowly see people devolve into just the gross, emotional, like, nasty gut reaction that is what racism basically is, where you're just kind of like, oh no, like, this other person, I don't like that, without really analyzing what's driving those emotions. This story was just very upsetting for me.
The minority against minority thing really troubles me, because it's interesting the way you put it, of, like, it puts all of us down when this kind of stuff happens. But the way I read it was more like, we should be standing up for each other. Like, every POC has gone through some shit for, each community has had its own struggles based on the way they look and the history that they've had with America and with white people. And so especially during this kind of time, we should be banding together, not trying to like separate us apart even further. So that like really bothered me. And then the attackers were like 15 or something, right? Like
they were young.
They were kids. Mm-hmm. And so to your point of like hatred and racism just being these like gut reactions of like, you're not even thinking about it. These kids also, I feel kind of bad for them, but I also not. But I'm kind of like, was it worth it for you to have to display that kind of act? Because you've now probably like ruined your life, because if you didn't already have a criminal record before, you certainly do now. And like, what implication does that have on your future?
Yeah, I think that really goes to the insidiousness of racism, related to kind of what you were saying with the age. It's another thing that refutes the idea that racism is just extremism, right? It's only those crazy people who live in their who live in the swamp and wear KKK hats, and it's like a minority of people. It's not. It can like anyone can have a racist reaction to something. I can't speak to you and tell you that I've never had a racist reaction to something. I definitely have, and I think everybody does, but it really matters what happens after you have that feeling. Like, are you going to think about what you're feeling and try to diffuse that, or are you just going to act crazy? And I think this is one of those situations that really highlights that racism is not like a pocket thing that lives in only areas that are not major metropolitan areas. It's everywhere. It's in everyone, and there's always the potential that it can kind of pop out. The other thing that I wanted to talk about with age, and I think I feel particularly privileged about it, is I personally feel like most of these, anecdotally, I feel like most of these attacks happen against older Asian Americans, people who look like they might have immigrated here, because I think that's what people are seeing on the news stories when they see like, oh, virus came from China, cut to shot of Wuhan. There's like old people, like people who look just like people here because they immigrated from there, right? They dress the same, they kind of maybe have some of the same mannerisms, versus like we don't. We look very much like we're westernized kids, basically. So that's the other thing, is that I feel in a way privileged in a bad way, because I don't look like I'm from there, and as a result of that, I do feel like I need to be more careful as I go outside, but I don't feel as pressured as I think I would if I looked like someone who just immigrated here.
That's a really interesting point of view. I would play devil's advocate here, in that when I was in Spain, and you also studied abroad in Spain, we had very similar college lives, but one of the thoughts that I kept having in my mind was like, I literally look nothing like these Chinese immigrants that are in Spain, because for those of you who don't know, in Spain, all of the people who own the kind of like corner stores, delis, and like pawning things on the street are Chinese immigrants. And they are like straight from China, Chinese people. So I didn't feel like I looked anything like them. Like, I'm very dark, they're very light, I dress very differently. Obviously my like accent for when I speak Spanish would be very different, because I'm basing it off an American accent, So there are all these things in my head where I'm like, it's so obvious that I'm like different from those people. And yet, we talked about this before, but like, I was getting called China like on the street every fucking day, every 5 seconds, because in their minds, I didn't look any different from those people. So like, I do think there was a bit of like a narrow view when we're thinking of like, I'm so different from that group, because to the point of before, we're talking about us as an Asian community being seen as the other, and especially being carved out as other now during this like dividing time. I think it's very easy for non-Asian people to group us all as together, whether you are straight from Asia, just moved here a month ago, or you were born here like 6th generation Asian American. I don't think that line is necessarily there right now. And For me, the age of like that woman being old and a lot of old people being attacked, for me, I see that more as like they are easy targets. Like these attackers have a lot of hate and they're trying to find some scapegoat, and they know that old people are an easy target. Like you're not going to fight back as much as a young person who's fit and healthy. It's easier to attack a helpless old person, and that makes me really sad. But that's my perspective of why it's happening a lot to old people. Not so much. I think there is definitely a point of like similarity that you could perceive of like, you know, they act more and dress more like the people in Wuhan. But I think it more has to do with like their fragility.
Wow. I mean, honestly, that just makes me feel worse about it. Like, you're gonna kick an old person while they're down? Like, Jesus. So, we know that there are many, many reports of things that are not great that are happening across the country and in our communities, but we also wanted to highlight some really good, shining, bright moments that have been happening through all of this, and how members of our community are really coming together and making things happen in this crisis. So, Angela, would you like to share your uplifting story of the week?
Yes. For my uplifting story today, I wanted to kind of tie together our last few episodes and draw on something that is coming from our homeland, Taiwan. So, for those who are not aware, Taiwan is one of the major success stories of the COVID outbreak right now because they acted super early. Like, as soon as the first few cases were reported from Wuhan, they're like, shut this shit down. Because, you know, Taiwan's very close to China. So they were able to take super swift action, make sure that they cut off travel, they implemented the must wear masks or you're going to be fined heavily rules. And overall, just did like really, really well, to the point that now, months after the first case was reported in Wuhan, like they are reporting some of the lowest numbers to date. And it's just such a shining light. And so it's already really awesome that, like, you know, our motherland is one of the shining examples of having really strong policy during this time. But not only that, they're not just like gloating about their success, they're doing something about trying to help the rest of the international community. So my uplifting story is about how Taiwan in the last week or two announced that they are donating 10 million masks globally.
Wow.
So they are donating 7 million to Europe because, you know, Spain, Italy, etc. are getting hit real hard. So they're disproportionately donating a lot to Europe, and 2 million to the US. This is just so uplifting because it's like, it's such a good show of leadership too from the president, because she has come out in a lot of speeches to be like, you know, this is not the time to just focus on our little community. This is the time to band together as the international community. Like, we are one, you know, human race. So we need to help each other out, and donating this much of your money, your resources to help out countries that are not your own is just like such an uplifting story for me, and I'm sure for a lot of people. So I'm very proud of our motherland.
Oh, wow. This is such a cute story. Fun fact, the man who invented the N95 respirators, Peter Tsai, is Taiwanese.
I did not know that.
I actually was listening to NPR, and he's retired now, but when all of this happened, they brought him out of retirement. They're like, can you figure out how we can reuse these masks safely, because we don't have enough of them.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, Taiwanese. I love it. All right. So what's your story? Uplifting stories.
So my uplifting story is about a restaurant called Zen Yai here in my neighborhood in Sunnyside, Queens, maybe 1 or 2 miles away from one of the most hardest affected areas in the city, which is like the Elmhurst neighborhood of Queens. So that hospital has been hit really hard with patients and not enough equipment. So they've really been looking for like resources, PPE, like people to just help out. And I think what I've seen come out of the community in terms of like restaurants and people volunteering their time and services there has been phenomenal. And I just wanted to focus on this particular restaurant because A, I have eaten there before and it's really nice. And B, actually the owners of this restaurant, their restaurant burned down last year. So they're
shit.
technically like not even really in the community anymore, but they're still helping to support the Elmhurst Hospital by joining the community kind of push to have food made available for all the hospital workers during this time period. And I think that this is just, it's a small thing, but it's small acts like these, like small gestures like this that come from the local community that I really do think matter and are really important to kind of counterbalance the terrible things that we were just talking about earlier. So I really love that this effort is community driven. I really love that despite the hardships that this restaurant and restaurateur team has gone through, they still feel like they belong to the community and they want to give something back during a difficult time like this.
So selfless, especially after having a disastrous fire burning down your restaurant moment so recently. It's like going beyond your own personal troubles and focusing on the bigger picture.
A lot of you have been asking how we got started podcasting.
Actually, it's super easy. We started by using the Anchor app. You can record, add music, and best of all, your podcast is automatically published to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more.
If you're looking for a new hobby to fill your time,
or just have a lot of something to say,
or you just want to learn something new,
come podcast with us on Anchor.
Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
All right, so we are now in our fortune cookie closing section. And even though this episode has been quite heavy in a lot of ways, we wanted to make sure that we still end on a sweet treat. And Jesse will tell you more about what that is. Don't worry, it's tasteful. But before we get into that, we did want to plug our usual call to action to have you guys email us about your opinion on this topic. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on the matter. If you have experienced any harassment during this time, or if you've seen some really uplifting stuff coming from the community or helping the community during this time, those are all things that we'd love to hear from you and we'd love to share on an upcoming episode. So feel free to email us at telluswhereyou'refrom@gmail.com. And again, that your is YOURE.
So speaking of uplifting things, we wanted to cap off our episode this week by giving you guys information to some local and national groups where you can donate if you're interested to contribute to the fight against racism and empowerment of our communities. So I'm going to feature the one that I picked for New York City, which is the Chinese American Planning Council. And their mission is to promote the social empowerment of Chinese American, immigrant, and low-income communities. And if you didn't know this, you can donate directly to them through the link in our description, or you can set them as your default donation recipient at smile.amazon.com.
Other groups, nonprofits. Jesse covered off East Coast. I'm going to cover off West Coast. So earlier I mentioned the group that founded that incident report that's helping give a voice to all of the people in the community that are experiencing harassment during this time. That is the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council. I think they're playing a huge role right now in shining a light on what's happening to our community and giving legitimacy and data to our policymakers to do something about it. And a fun fact, they are LA based, so they are representing California, and they are also a nonprofit. So you can either donate to them at the link that again is in our show notes, or you can set your Amazon Smile preference to them if you prefer to donate to a California-based one.
The final organization we wanted to plug tonight is a national organization, Southern Poverty Law Center. I think many of you guys might notice that from seeing various press releases that they put out, but this organization basically tracks and documents racist groups around the US, and their focus is on addressing inequality, both from the racism standpoint, immigration equality, LGBT equality. So once all of this is over and kind of the immediate in your face racism is gone, we hope that everyone will continue to donate to the organizations we just plugged before, as well as national organizations like this, to continue to empower our disenfranchised communities.
Yeah, I just want to plug that, like, even though we focused this episode on what's happening to the Asian community right now under the context of the COVID-19 situation, racism happens all the time and not just to our community. So this is the time to band together for all people of color. So that's why we wanted to highlight an organization that's not just focused on the Asian community, but helping to stop hatred of all communities.
Yeah. So link to SPL Center will also be found in the description of the podcast episode.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. So, as always, if you liked this episode, we ask that you please like, follow, subscribe, and share. I think that's something that we haven't talked about a lot, but please do if you're enjoying this, so that we can make sure that we keep coming out with new content each week. And with that said, come back next week because we'll have a new episode for you then.
Until then.
Yeah.
再见, bitches. What?